My son got married 8 months ago. In a backyard ceremony he and his fiancée had planned meticulously for over a year. I gave a toast that evening that I'd rehearsed in my truck for 3 days beforehand, wanting badly to get it right for a boy I'd raised largely alone after his mother left when he was 9. The next morning, he called me, not to thank me, but to tell me, in a tone I'd never heard him use with me before, that I'd embarrassed him in front of his new wife's entire family, that the toast had gone on too long, mentioned too much of our difficult history, made people uncomfortable at what was supposed to be a celebration. He said his mother-in-law had asked him, quietly, during dinner, whether everything was all right between us, and that the question itself had humiliated him more than anything I'd actually said. I want to back up, because this story doesn't make sense without the 26 years that led to that phone call. My wife left when Aaron was 9, moved across the country with a man from her office, and I raised him alone through the hardest stretch of his childhood, while working full days supervising residential construction crews. I wasn't a perfect father. I missed school events for job sites that couldn't wait, learned to braid hair badly out of a library book, and made every mistake a working single father of that era tends to make. But I showed up, every single day, for the following 17 years, through his difficult teenage stretch, through community college, through the job that eventually became his career. The toast I gave at his wedding mentioned some of that history, not to embarrass him, I believed at the time, but because I was genuinely, overwhelmingly proud of the specific distance we'd traveled together. From a 9-year-old boy abandoned by his mother to a grown man marrying someone who clearly loved him. I thought the story was one of resilience. He apparently heard it as an airing of grievances in front of people he wanted to impress. I didn't argue with him on that call. I told him I was sorry it had landed the way it had, and I meant that sincerely. But something in the specific tone he used, a tone that suggested 26 years of showing up, had been reduced, in that one moment, to an embarrassment to be managed in front of new in-laws, sat with me differently than I expected it to. I want to describe the toast itself briefly, because I think the actual content matters for understanding what happened next. I talked about the year Aaron was 9, the year his mother left, and how he'd insisted, against my initial judgment, on trying out for the school baseball team that same spring despite everything happening at home. I talked about driving him to 6 a.m. practices before my own construction shifts, exhausted, because I understood, even then, that he needed something in his life that hadn't been touched by his mother's absence. I talked about watching him struggle through his teenage years without a mother present, about the specific loneliness of being the only single father at school events, and about how proud I was, standing there decades later, watching him marry someone who loved him as completely as I'd always hoped someone eventually would. None of it, in my own memory, was delivered with anything but love, but I understood, replaying it later, that raw honesty and polished celebration don't always sit comfortably in the same room, especially not in front of people meeting your family history for the first time. I want to tell you what I did with that feeling, because I didn't do what either of us initially expected. I want to describe that week honestly, because I think the specific texture of it matters more than the general summary. I replayed that toast obsessively for the first 2 days, trying to identify the exact sentence that had caused the offense, unable to fully locate it, because in my own memory, every part of it had come from genuine pride, rather than any intention to embarrass anyone. I called my sister on the 3rd day, the only person who'd actually attended that wedding and witnessed the toast firsthand, and asked her honestly whether I'd said something inappropriate. She told me, carefully, that the toast had been long and emotional, more raw than a typical wedding toast, but that nothing in it had struck her as inappropriate, simply more honest than the polished, brief toasts most people expect at that kind of event. That answer didn't resolve much, honestly. It confirmed that I hadn't committed some clear social error, but it also meant I couldn't simply apologize for a specific mistake and move past the tension. What Aaron was actually upset about, I slowly began to understand, wasn't the content of the toast itself, but what it represented, a public, unedited version of our history that he'd apparently spent considerable effort curating a cleaner version of for his new wife's family, a family from a different social background than the one Aaron and I had actually come from. I spent part of that same week going through old photographs, something I hadn't done in years, looking specifically for pictures from Aaron's childhood, trying to locate some clearer memory of whether I'd somehow raised him to feel ashamed of our circumstances without ever intending to. I found a picture from his 8th grade graduation, both of us in front of our small rented house at the time, the paint peeling slightly on the porch railing behind us, both of us smiling in a way that, in the moment, had felt like simple pride. Looking at it that week, I found myself wondering, uncomfortably, whether that same photograph, viewed through Aaron's adult eyes and the specific social context of his new marriage, now registered differently than it once had. Evidence of struggle rather than evidence of resilience, depending entirely on which lens you brought to it. I felt something specific and uncomfortable settle in over that week, a feeling I hadn't fully named until my sister said it plainly on a call near the end of it. "Richard, I think Aaron's a little ashamed of where you both came from, and I think that toast forced him to sit with that shame in front of exactly the people he most wanted to impress." I didn't want to believe that about my son. But once she said it, I couldn't fully unhear it, because it explained the specific tone of that phone call better than any simpler explanation did. My sister said something else on that call too, something that stayed with me even longer than her initial observation. She reminded me that she'd watched Aaron, at various family gatherings over the years, gradually adjust the way he described our history to new people in his life, softening details, shortening timelines, occasionally omitting his mother's departure entirely in favor of vaguer language. She said she'd noticed it happening slowly for years, without ever mentioning it to me directly, assuming it was simply a private adjustment he was entitled to make on his own terms. Hearing that pattern named so specifically, something I'd apparently missed entirely, despite being the other person in that same history, was its own particular kind of difficult realization that week. I'd been planning, loosely, informally, for over a year, to eventually explore retiring somewhere my modest construction pension would stretch further than it did in the expensive coastal town I'd lived in my entire working life. It had been an abstract someday plan, nothing urgent. That week, it stopped feeling abstract. I booked a one-way flight to the Philippines on the 7th day after that phone call, less as an escape from Aaron specifically, and more as a decision to stop waiting for a someday that kept getting pushed further away by other people's schedules and expectations. I want to be honest that I also spent part of that week doing something less productive, quietly researching Sarah's family online, the family Aaron had apparently wanted to shield from our more complicated history. They were, by every visible measure, comfortable in a way our own family history never quite managed to be. A father who'd been a regional bank executive, a mother active in charity board circles, a wedding venue and guest list that reflected decades of a specific kind of social ease Aaron and I had never actually possessed. I don't share this to criticize them. I'm sure they're genuinely kind people. I share it because seeing that contrast laid out so plainly helped me understand, even before Aaron articulated it himself months later, exactly what he might have been trying to protect that evening, and exactly how much that protection had apparently required distancing himself from the specific texture of how we'd actually lived. I'd done enough background research over that informal planning year that the move itself wasn't reckless, even though the timing was clearly emotional. I'd researched cities, visa requirements, cost of living, enough to know the general shape of what I was walking into, even without the kind of exhaustive 4-month process some other retirees describe. The first months were harder than I expected, for reasons that had less to do with the country itself and more to do with the unresolved tension with Aaron sitting underneath everything I did. I found myself, more than once, drafting long text messages explaining my side of the toast, then deleting them, unsure whether sending them would resolve anything or simply reopen a wound that time might handle better on its own. I settled in a mid-sized coastal city, found a small apartment through a local rental agency, and spent the first 6 weeks in a specific kind of limbo, physically starting a new chapter while emotionally still standing in that backyard. replaying a toast that had somehow undone 26 years of fatherhood in a single family member's mind. What eventually shifted things wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation. The same pattern I've since learned defines most of these stories rather than the more dramatic version people expect. A neighbor, a retired local contractor named Ernesto, noticed me sitting alone on my building's shared terrace during my third week and struck up a conversation about, of all things, construction methods, a shared professional language that gave us an immediate, substantive connection neither of us expected from a chance terrace conversation. Within a month, Ernesto had introduced me to 2 other retired tradesmen, and we'd started a standing Friday coffee that gave my week its first real structure since arriving. I remember that first terrace conversation with Ernesto in specific detail, because it was the first genuinely relaxed conversation I'd had since that phone call with Aaron. He asked about my career, and when I mentioned residential construction supervision, his entire posture changed, leaning forward with real interest, asking detailed questions about specific building techniques and regional codes that most people, even close friends back home, had never shown much curiosity about. I found myself talking for nearly 2 hours that first evening. Not about Aaron, not about the toast, simply about decades of a career I'd apparently been quietly proud of, without fully realizing how much I'd missed discussing it with someone who understood the specific satisfaction of the work itself. By the 3rd month, I had that Friday coffee, a modest garden I'd started on my small balcony mostly out of boredom, and a slowly returning sense that the life I was building here existed on its own terms, separate from whatever remained unresolved with Aaron back home. I also want to mention a specific detail about that garden, because it ended up mattering more than I expected. Ernesto, noticing my attempts were producing mostly wilted, overwatered disappointments, started stopping by on Sunday mornings to help, bringing cuttings from his own established balcony garden, and a patience with my mistakes that reminded me, oddly, of teaching a young Aaron to throw a baseball decades earlier, the same specific pleasure of watching someone slowly improve at something through repeated, unglamorous practice. By the 4th month, I had actual tomatoes, a small, genuinely satisfying accomplishment that had nothing to do with anything back home, and everything to do with the specific, ordinary rhythm I was rebuilding here one Sunday morning at a time. Aaron called 5 months in, the first real conversation we'd had beyond a handful of brief, careful check-ins since that original phone call. He asked, directly, why I'd left so suddenly, and whether it had been because of him. I told him the truth, the same way I've tried to tell it throughout this video. I told him the toast itself hadn't been the entire reason, but that the specific tone of that call, the sense that 26 years of showing up had been reduced to something requiring damage control in front of new in-laws, had made me realize I'd been waiting too long for a someday retirement plan that kept deferring to other people's comfort. I told him I loved him, and that I didn't regret raising him the way I had, difficult stretches and all, and that the toast had come from real pride, not any intention to embarrass him. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said something I've turned over often since. Dad, I think I was more ashamed of myself that night than of you. Sarah's family has this whole polished, easy story about their life, and ours was never that. And I think I panicked, watching you tell the real version of it, because some part of me still hasn't made peace with how hard those years actually were for both of us. I asked him, gently, why he'd never told me any of this before, why he'd carried that particular shame alone for so many years, without ever once mentioning it during the countless ordinary conversations we'd had across 2 decades. He was quiet for a moment before answering. I think, he said slowly, telling you would have meant admitting I was embarrassed by the exact thing you were proudest of, how hard you worked to raise me alone. I didn't know how to say that without it sounding like I was ungrateful for everything you actually did. I told him I understood that fear better than he probably expected me to, because some version of it had lived quietly in me too, across all those years, wondering whether the specific, unglamorous way I'd managed to raise him was ever something he'd be proud of, or simply something he'd eventually want to leave fully behind him. That admission changed something between us more than any apology from either side could have. We talked for over an hour that call, longer than we'd spoken in years, about the actual difficulty of those 17 years after his mother left. Difficulty we'd apparently both been quietly managing separately, rather than acknowledging together. He apologized, genuinely, for the tone of that original call, and I apologized for not recognizing sooner how much shame he'd apparently been carrying about a childhood neither of us had chosen. Aaron told me something specific during that call I hadn't fully known before, despite having lived through those years alongside him. He said that in middle school, a classmate had once asked him, in front of others, why he never talked about his mother, and that he'd made up a story on the spot about her being often away for work, rather than explaining the truth. He said he'd kept some version of that same deflection running for years afterward, through high school, through college, gradually building a slightly softened, slightly more socially comfortable version of our family history that he could offer people without having to explain the actual specifics of abandonment, of me learning to braid hair from a library book, of the particular loneliness of being the only single father showing up to school events alone. Hearing that, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped in 26 years of raising him. That Aaron hadn't just endured his mother's absence as a child. He'd spent the following 2 decades quietly managing the social presentation of that absence, building careful narrative armor around a wound I'd assumed, wrongly, he'd simply outgrown once he became a stable, successful adult. The toast, unfiltered and specific in front of exactly the people he'd built his most careful version of that armor for, had torn straight through 2 decades of quiet management in a single evening. He and Sarah visited 4 months ago, their first trip here, and I watched him sit with Ernesto and the Friday coffee group, listening to stories about my working life that he'd apparently never fully heard before, despite having lived through the version of me that came home from those same job sites every evening for 17 years. There was a specific moment during that visit I keep returning to. Ernesto, without any prompting from me, told Sarah a detailed story about a difficult commercial job I'd supervised years before either of them knew me, describing a moment where I'd caught a structural error another crew had missed, potentially preventing a serious accident. Sarah turned to Aaron afterward and said, genuinely impressed, "I don't think I ever fully understood what your dad actually did all those years, beyond just construction." I watched Aaron's face while she said it. A specific mixture of pride and something like regret. The particular expression of someone realizing they'd spent years quietly managing an incomplete story about their own father, rather than simply asking him to tell the complete one. If you've had a moment like that phone call, where something you said with pride landed as an embarrassment to someone you love, I want to tell you what this specific rift taught me. I don't think this kind of hurt resolves quickly, and I don't think it should be rushed toward a tidy resolution simply because a tidy resolution makes for a more satisfying story. Ours took 5 months of distance, an honest conversation, and a visit before it started to genuinely heal, and I suspect for many families it might take considerably longer than that. Sometimes the offense isn't really about the specific words. It's about what those words force someone to sit with about their own history, their own shame, their own carefully curated version of a past they haven't fully made peace with yet. I don't think Aaron was wrong to feel what he felt that night, even though I don't think I did anything wrong giving that toast. Both of those things turned out to be true simultaneously, the way I've come to expect complicated family moments usually are. I've stopped needing there to be a single guilty party in this story, and I think that shift, more than any other single realization, is what finally allowed both of us to move past it together, rather than continuing to litigate whose version of that evening was the correct one. I also think the move itself, however emotionally driven the timing was, gave both of us something useful. Distance and time that let the initial hurt settle before we tried to actually talk it through, rather than having that difficult conversation in the immediate, raw aftermath of the wedding itself. I don't think I would have recommended the timing to anyone else in the same situation. But I also can't say, honestly, that a more careful, less reactive timeline would have produced the same eventual conversation, the one where Aaron finally admitted what he'd actually been carrying. I think about my sister's comment often too, the one that first named what was actually happening, that Aaron might have been more ashamed of himself than of me that night. I think that kind of clarity, from someone outside the immediate hurt, matters more than people give it credit for. I was too close to the situation that week to see past my own wounded pride at being called an embarrassment by the boy I'd raised alone. It took someone with enough distance from the specific moment, but enough history with our actual family, to name the more complicated truth underneath it. If you're in the middle of a similar rift right now, I'd encourage you to find that person in your own life, someone who knew the full history well enough to help you see past the sting of the most recent moment. Ernesto and I still have our Friday coffee. Aaron and Sarah are already planning a longer visit next year, and the toast that started all of this sits, now, as a story we can actually talk about honestly, rather than a wound either of us has to carefully avoid. If you're sitting with a similar rift right now, I hope you find your own version of that eventual honest conversation, whatever distance or time it takes to get there. I've also started, in the past 2 months, writing down some of the stories I told during that original toast, along with others I never got the chance to include, partly for myself and partly because Aaron asked, during his visit, whether I'd ever consider putting some of it in writing for his own future children to eventually read. I found that request more moving than almost anything else that's happened since this entire story began. The same history that had once felt like an embarrassment to manage in front of new in-laws has become, 8 months later, something he actively wants preserved and passed forward. I don't think either of us could have predicted that specific turn on the morning after that difficult phone call, and I think that unpredictability is worth remembering if you're currently standing where I was standing then. Certain a rift has permanently changed something that time and honesty might still be capable of repairing. I'll see you in the next one. Whatever version of this story you're currently living, I hope your own eventual conversation comes sooner than mine did, and lands as gently as ours finally managed to.